Hey guys, my name is John and welcome back to For the Classical Guitarist, YouTube's classical guitar community where we talk all things classical guitar. If you're new here and you like what you see, hopefully you will consider subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell, and checking out some other videos of mine. It would be a great way to support the channel. Anyway, let's get started. So today, September 15th, marks the beginning of Hispanic Heritage Month here in the United States. But it got me thinking, outside of people like Leo Brouwer, Augustine Barrios, and maybe Julio Segures and Maximo Diego Pujol, we don't really play much music, let alone know much music, by Hispanic composers. So my hope is that with this video that we can change that. I'll be selecting one piece from each country of South America and sharing it with you. So when selecting composers and players for this video, of course I could stick with the big names. However, I figured that for this video, I want to do something a bit different. Share something that maybe many classical guitarists don't get to see that often. So I'm going to be picking composers that, at least as far as I know, are not nearly as well known as some of the names just mentioned. Yes, some of them will be common ones and you'll see very soon, but a handful of them I want to say are going to be a little less common. And the same thing goes for players. The players that I'm choosing are mostly going to be players that come from these countries where this music is originally from. Before we get started, there are going to be a few rules. I guess only two. Rule number one is that the country has to be primarily Spanish speaking. So unfortunately that takes out Brazil, which, as I'm sure you know, has tons of guitar music. And rule number two is that the piece that is being played has to be one that was originally written for the guitar. It can't be a traditional folk song that was then later arranged for the guitar. It can be inspired by one, but it can't just be a full-on arrangement because that kind of defeats the purpose. Let's go ahead and start all the way up top with Venezuela. And this one, you guys, if you're a classical guitarist, you're probably going to be familiar with because that's going to be the Venezuelan Waltzes by Antonio Lauro. So for this one, because I picked a pretty common piece as well as a pretty common composer, I'm going to go ahead and make the music selection a little different. This is going to be a duet version of the famous piece Natalia, played by a guitar duet in Venezuela. Coming up next, we're going to be shifting over to the left to the country of Colombia. And in Colombia, we have the style known as Bambuco, which is pretty much a dance style which was influenced by the European waltz. This one is one that I think is going to be a little bit less common because I picked a player and a composer that many people, at least myself, wasn't that familiar with. The composer would be Gentil Montaña, who is a Colombian classical guitarist and composer. Let's check out his Bambuco, which is the third movement from his Suite Colombiana No. 2. Going down from the left of Colombia is the country of Ecuador, which is a country that is pretty small, and honestly it was a hard time for me trying to find music that is actually from Ecuador that was written for the classical guitar, but I did find one. The piece that I found is the Carabuela, which is by Terry Pazmino, which is a traditional Ecuadorian folk song which then later inspired this piece that you're going to hear in just a second. The next country right below Ecuador and Colombia is a personal favorite for me, which is going to be the country of Peru, which has tons of guitar music in my opinion. But biases aside, the piece that I want to share with you is going to be a piece by the famous Peruvian guitarist Raul Zarate. And he's played everything from traditional songs being arranged for guitar, making his own arrangements, and pretty much everything else in between. But the piece I'm going to play of his is going to be a piece called Carnaval de Arequipa, which is a city in Peru. Coming up next, right below Peru, also along the coast of South America, is going to be the country of Chile. Now, this one might sound kind of familiar if you guys are familiar with the piece Cueca by Agustin Barrios. This piece is one that is influenced by the Chilean dance the Cueca, but I want to pick one that's a bit more unknown. And funny enough, it's almost the opposite. The piece that I'm choosing is going to be a piece called the Anticueca, which is almost making fun of and making the cueca more modernized. It copies the rhythms, and if you're familiar with Cueca by Barrios, you're going to definitely hear some similarities, but it's going to sound much different than a traditional cueca. This Anticueca is by Violeta Parra, who is a traditional Chilean singer and guitarist. Check it out. Okay, so now coming more to the inside of South America, this one is the only one on this list that I think the composer isn't actually from the country where it's from, but it's a piece that I loved and I do want to just share it with you. The country would be the country of Bolivia, and the piece would be Boliviano by Celso Machado. Now, Celso Machado, if you guys don't know, is a traditional Brazilian composer and guitarist. But he wrote music just like people like Barrios and Leo Brauer did in style of other Latin American countries. This one is one that I particularly like, and it's written for a guitar duet, so hopefully you guys like it as well. Okay, now even though I said I was going to try to stay away from the big name composers, it's hard to talk about this country without talking about this one composer, and of course that country would be Paraguay, and the composer would be Agustin Barrios, probably one of the most famous classical guitar composers of all South America. And the piece I picked of his, of course, is going to be his Paraguayan dance, because Paraguay, Barrios, obvious choice. Now, what makes this one special is, of course, yes, somebody like Agustin Barrios is a big name in the classical guitar field. But the selection that I chose is actually a bit more interesting because it's a recording of Barrios playing Barrios. Coming up second to last is going to be the country of Uruguay, which is one that I thought I would have a hard time finding, but believe it or not, one of the most famous guitarists out there is from there. And that would be the guitarist Abel Carlevaro, who everybody knows. He's wrote tons of books on technique, tons of books on pieces and arrangement, and he's just a name that we probably know in the guitar field. But funny enough, many guitar players don't know where he's from, or don't even know where a lot of his music was influenced by. Again, at least I didn't know. So Carlevaro wrote this piece called the Milonga Oriental, which is a piece influenced by the traditional Uruguayan dance, the Milonga. So this one, just like the Barrios example, features Carlevaro playing his own piece. It's really great that a lot of these composers that were writing back then were alive long enough to be able to record some of the music themselves. So check it out and let me know what you guys think. If you guys are familiar with Carlevaro's work, you probably know this one, but if you're not, I hope that you guys enjoy listening to it. And finally, coming up last, which is the country you guys probably all were waiting for, the probably most guitar-focused country in South America, with the exception of Brazil, which would be Argentina. Now, for this one, there's tons of choices I could have picked. Of course, like I mentioned, I could have picked pieces by Julio Segreras, Maximo Diego Pujol, Emilio Pujol, I believe, and Astor Piazzolla. But those ones people know, and I wanted to pick one that I thought many people, at least some, might not be familiar with. The composer isn't that common, but the player in this case is. The player that you're going to see in a second is somebody known as Chacho Tirao, who was Piazzolla's guitarist for pretty much as long as Piazzolla was a big touring act. This guy pretty much grew up playing guitar in the streets and really understands Argentinian music as well as tango music probably better than anybody else. So for this video, I picked a piece called Te Vas Milonga, which is a piece very similar to the Milonga we heard from Uruguay, except this one is written more in the Argentinian style of Milonga. You should be able to hear some differences in the style, but this piece would be by the famous guitarist and composer Abel Fleury. This is one that I'm not that familiar with, but from looking it up, it seems that some big name players have recorded music by him, so I'm sure that he is a name that some people know. Anyway, check it out and let me know what you guys think. Okay, so that's all for this video, and hopefully you guys saw and experienced some new music that you weren't familiar with before. I know that I definitely did when making this, so hopefully you got the same when watching it. These are definitely my favorite kinds of videos to make, ones that when going into it I think I know something and then I learn something totally different that I have to share with you. Anyway, stay tuned for part 2 because I plan to do that hopefully in the next few days, if not next week. And if you're watching this video already, then part 2 should be popping up somewhere over here. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.